Okay.
Go ahead.
Hi. Hi, everyone. We are live. Welcome to our Zoom audience as well. This is the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law weekly seminar. We have now begun 2 weeks of winter quarter remote, and we are fortunately back in person this week. And we are very excited to have with us today Dr. Johannes Ludewig, a visiting scholar at CDDRL for the year. If you've ever been to Germany and marveled at its infrastructure, particularly its railway system, Johannes likely deserves the credit. Yeah. He has had a distinguished career in German politics, most recently as chairman of the National Regulatory Control Council from 2006 to 2021. Before that, chairman of German Railways, also known as Deutsche Bahn, and afterwards Community of European Railways in Brussels from 1997 to 2010. Prior to that, he was state secretary in the Federal Ministry of Economic and Financial Advisor to Chancellor Kohl, and he was responsible for economic reconstruction of East Germany after reunification in 1990. And before all of that, he was a graduate student here at Stanford, where he received. So today he will be discussing regulatory and administrative reform in Germany. Thank you so much.
Yep. Well, thank you very much for the kind, nice introduction. And indeed, having been in Stanford is half a century ago, you know, so it's a long time. And but nevertheless, I'm very happy, I think, to be here again and to share with you some experience, I think, of the last 15 years when I was chairman of the National Regulatory Control Council. If you're interested in what I did before, being what was mentioned, advisor to Chancellor Kohl on financial and economic questions, and also on the particular on the reconstruction and reorganization of the East German economy after reunification. So to transition of a state-run economy into a market economy. Of course, we can do that on another occasion, and this is also, I think, it doesn't happen so often in the world, you know. So that's therefore, I think it might be interesting to some of you. So we just started with the last 15 years. I try to get it moving, but it doesn't really. Can we take the next one? Okay, do it. Can you do it?
I can do it.
Okay. I know it's
okay.
Okay. So the National Regulatory Control Council is not a unique institution in the world. There are similar institutions in other countries. Having talked to Catherine yesterday, I looked it up again, and it came, for example, in the United States. You have the OIRA, you know, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs in the White House. They are not independent as we are, but nevertheless, they have similar issues, I think, on the table. And there are other bodies. The OECD, for example, is investing a lot of resources into this, regularly publishing state-of-the-art on better regulation and things related. And they have a special subcommittee, the so-called RPC, Regulatory Policy Committee, which is very active, and we are also attending and following, I think, this work. So it's not unique, but nevertheless, just to give you a few details, you see. Let me see whether I can. Yeah, see, we are in the business since on the upper left side 2006. We are 10 members, and what is important is independent. And the starting point, if you go down, there's a certain law. Our activity is based not on a government decision, but on a law, which is a fundamental difference. Because if the government has, whatever reason, is angry about something what an independent commission has said, there could be the temptation, okay, we are throwing them out, or we are replacing people, or whatever, you know, and they cannot do that. They have to change the law. And that is a completely different procedure and much more difficult, I think, to do. So that is something a key part of our independence has always been that our work is based on a law and not on a government decision. And how do you become a member? The federal government is making a proposal. Usually they are asking the parliamentary parties, making proposals, not only the government parliamentary supporting groups, but also from the opposition. And finally, they make proposals, and the federal president of the republic, he is appointing the members of this body. So we have a secretariat, 15 people, and the office is we are linked to the chancellery. To make clear, it's really something which what we are doing concerns everybody, not just one ministry. And other actors in this game here, everybody is here. The Minister of State and the Federal Chancellery. So there's one state minister being my counterpart, or having been my counterpart, you know, on the government side. And very important here is it's a committee of state secretaries. So there's a committee, and every ministry is represented by a state secretary. And they are our, let's say, our partner on the other side. If we want to change something, how the government works, we have to convince them. We cannot give commands, but we have to convince them, and you will see later on a number of issues how this actually works. And what is very important also, the Federal Statistical Office, because they have a lot of know-how, you know, on how do you calculate, you know, bureaucratic burdens, you know, and so they have been a companion on the whole way, and we have a very close relationship. And what is an advantage is the Federal Statistical Office has a reputation within the government being not so political, being very neutral, you know, and therefore they have a pretty good authority in terms of statistics and these methodological questions. Okay, next one here, just to show you that you see what is the council all about. This was the handing over of our annual report to the Chancellor. And you see all of us, of course, the Chancellor here in the middle. I don't have to, so, and then you see the council around the Chancellor. So you see, by the way, female dominance in our body, you know, and the person here on the right is the state minister in the chancellery, so my counterpart in the government. You see, there's pretty much place in the chancellery, you know, so there's a nice building, and to show you a little bit the consequences of the pandemic. This was the handing over of the annual report a year before, 2020, and you see for pandemic reasons. Only my deputy here, Sabine, and myself were admitted, and the Chancellor and the State Minister. So just because of the pandemic. And the very old days, you see, that was before the pandemic, you know. So this makes really the difference, you know. People could really be a little bit closer together. You know? And this has really changed. Also, I think your work probably too, in a certain way, and also our work, you know. For example, these intensive discussions with the Committee of State Secretaries could simply not take place. If you have, you know that probably from your own, if you have to convince somebody, you know, on a difficult, differentiated subject, it makes a difference whether you're doing this via Zoom or whatever, you know, or whether you're sitting at the same table. So this is something, okay. What is the key part, what we are doing? Without going into all the details, but you see here, the key of what I've said is price tax on laws. That was the original idea. So how can we quantify what are the follow-up costs, the compliance costs? Not, of course, for the finance minister. This is always taken care of. Every government is a finance minister, and he is very attentive, you know, what the consequences of a law for his budget are. What is not so much, does not receive so much attention is, what are the follow-up costs to business, to citizens, and to the administration? And I'm really surprised about myself when I worked in the government in the 1980s and even 90s, you know, nobody cared about this, you know. The ministry said a wonderful idea, this was translated into legal text. The finance minister said, yes, wonderful or not, you know, depending how much money from the budget was necessary. And then it went to cabinet, and then it was adopted, and that was more or less, I mean, I shortened a little bit the whole story. And so, and the idea which came up in the 1990s was, okay, do we not have to look more carefully what legislation actually means, I think, to those who are concerned by this legislation? And that is the idea. So we are you see this here, you have the ministry, I think, ministerial draft. Then there's the review process before it gets to cabinet. Of course, what we have in every government, interministerial coordination. And what is very important in our system, at least being a federal country, the integration of the federal states and also business associations. Because if you do not have, that is what we learned, in the government, if there's not a very clear idea, what is the real environment, I think, into which I think a new piece of legislation will have its effect. You know, if you are not aware of these consequences, you could end up with a lot of surprises, you know. And this is the risk because in Germany, we have a federal government. This is very far away from the day-to-day reality. Between the federal government, you have the states, like in the United States, what we call Länder, and you have the local municipalities. And then comes the reality. And this is something, a big problem, and we have criticized a lot that these kind of participation, that means integration of the experience, you know, in practical life, in the implementation and enforcement of legislation. Really, for many procedures of legislation did not really receive sufficient, I think, attention. So, and the key point is at the end, we are giving an opinion, an official opinion on, not that we are saying the law is a good idea or the law is a bad idea. That is, of course, a political question. What we are controlling is the ministries have to present a calculation on the follow-up costs, following a certain methodology, which was, by the way, invented by the Dutch at the end of the 1990s, the so-called standard cost model, which allows you, I think, in a certain way, in a standardized way, to translate bureaucratic burden into figures and cost figures. And we have to control, did the ministries really show and present the real costs? Is the water calculation, is it correct or not? And if there's no control, of course, there could be a temptation for the ministries to keep the cost down, you know, to get acceptance, I think, by cabinet colleagues. So, and then it goes to cabinet, it goes to the parliament, and then enters into force, etc. And our opinion accompanies this project of legislation. It's attached to it officially, goes to parliament, and becomes public, you know, the moment it arrives here in parliament. So that is the process. And then what is interesting is 2 years later, after entering into force, the statistical office, I think, makes a subsequent measurement to see in reality, after the law was implemented, the estimate of costs originally, was it really confirmed by practice, by reality or not? So this is done 2 years, and then 3 to 5 years later, we have introduced, we come back to this so-called ex post, as an obligatory, mandatory ex post evaluation of the law under certain conditions. So, and then the idea, of course, is that this goes back, and if the evaluation shows that let's say the original ideas were not really confirmed by the practical experience, of course, it leads to changes, and the whole process can start again. So I will show you a little bit about 3 areas. I think we have been active: reduction of bureaucracy, better regulation, and then digitalization and modernization of the administration. So the first is reduction of bureaucracy. This was a big issue at the beginning of the year 2000 in many countries, not only in Germany. And the government was ambitious enough to say in the year 2006, okay, we are fixing, or we are fixing an objective, a target to reduce the existing bureaucratic burden. That means to reduce the existing burden of information obligations on companies, on business, you know, by 25%. This 25%, there was no real justification for this. The simple reason was the Dutch did the same exercise 5 years earlier. And so the people said, okay, as long as we have no better idea, why don't we also not take 25%? But the critical point was, when you say 25%, you must have an idea what is 100%. And nobody has a figure. And so what we had to do is, we had to do a baseline measurement. So, and that's where the point where the Federal Statistical Office comes in. And what was done, let's say within 2 years, 2006 and 2007, to go through the whole stock of federal legislation and to measure, the bureaucratic burden in the terms of information obligation imposed by law on business, particularly, of course, obligation to deliver information for statistics, etc. So, and then the idea was, okay, first, and this was done for 2 years, and ended up with a wonderful figure of 50 billion euros being at the overall added up, summary of bureaucratic burden to business. And the obligation was 25%, so 12 billion euros had to be, the burden had to be reduced. So I don't want to go to that. You can see here there were a couple of initiatives here, to realize this objective now. Also, in this point at this time, also a few increases, but of course substantial decrease. I don't want to go, but you see, of course, the introduction of electronic instruments, made a large contribution, I think, to this year. Electronic submission of annual turnover tax return, and here simplification of electronic invoicing. Just this electronic invoicing, replacing paperwork, was a contribution of 4 billion euros. So this was the you could do, if you want later on maybe to download this this presentation. You can go through the examples for reduction, relief, and also additional burden to achieve this target of a reduction of 25%, which was actually achieved in 2011. I don't want to again to go through this, but I don't know whether somebody of you has worked in the government, but these kind of discussions with ministries, were terrible. Because you have all the ministries around the table, and they say, okay, what can we do to reduce, obligations by business? The answer is we can do nothing. Everything is wonderful. So I can really tell you this was a tough exercise, a really tough exercise. And we had to get experts. We had to mobilize our own knowledge, my own experience, and always to make proposals and really to force the ministries, to show that certain ideas were not realistic or whatever. And if there would not have been the principal support by the Chancellor, number one, and number one of the coalition partners, Social Democrats at that time, that would never have worked. So the experience is the status quo, I think, is defended, I think, by all means, by the ministries usually. And it's a very tough work, to get them really moving at the end of the day. So once this exercise was over, the next step, we were asking ourselves, what can we do to keep, I think, the additional follow-up costs, the additional compliance costs somehow under control. And we were a little bit, not a little bit, we were really inspired by the British experience with the so-called one in, one out rule. I don't know whether you have heard about this. So the British started, in the I think it was about 2010 or 2009, introducing, say, okay, if a ministry comes up with a certain proposal, a legislative proposal, let's say follow-up costs are 100, whatever, a million or the same ministry has to present a proposal to reduce the burden, in another context, also by 100 by the end of the legislative period. So, and this was the idea of this one in, one out rule. And we were inspired by this, and we went to the government, long discussions, etc. You can imagine, to introduce this in Germany. And you can imagine the enthusiasm of the ministries was, fantastic. So there was, I think, if I look back on the 15 years, the fight for the introduction of the one in, one out was the toughest, I think, confrontation and internal confrontation between the council and the ministries. And once again, at the end, the State Secretary Committee took a vote and say no. And then I went to the Chancellor and to the number one of the coalition partner and said, if that is the last word, what you are saying, the credibility of the whole exercise is really at stake. And then the chancellor and the vice chancellor overruled the committee of state secretaries and said, okay, we are going forward with this. So really very unique experience. But what you can see is that was a time 2000, beginning of 2015, when this was introduced. And what is interesting here, the red line are the overall compliance costs. The blue line is the burden to business. And what is interesting to see, whether it's by coincidence or whether it is, there are other connections, from this on, it is pretty much stable. You know, whereas in the beginning, before this was introduced, we had substantial increases. By the way, another feature, what you can see is there's not a steady increase in compliance costs. There are certain, you know, specific laws who are really driving the cost drivers. It's not the laws in general. This was for energy saving ordinance, you know, that was when in Germany it was introduced, that every new building in Germany, a business building or a private building, had to respect much higher standards, you know, for heat isolation, etc. So pretty cost intensive. Introduction of a minimum wage in Germany. You know, Germany was a country not having any minimum wage, but the idea was the trade unions and the employers, they have to negotiate. This is not something for the state. For a number of reasons, this was changed, of course, and there was introduced a substantial cost increase. So, and then you see it's pretty steady. And maybe the time horizon is still too short to draw really conclusions from this, you know. But it's nevertheless quite interesting to see. And then the other point which is interesting to see, that's why the red circle is here, a change of cost drivers. You see business continues to be actually lower than 5 years ago. What really started increasing are the costs to the administration. You know, they were at the beginning pretty flat, then nothing really happened. And then starting about 2018-19, there were several initiatives, you know, driving the costs up. But here, a big jump, what they call introduction of full day provision for primary school children. And this, of course, if you make a full provision for primary school children, you have to hire a lot of personnel, so it's extremely cost intensive. As you can see, there were about 2 billion euros, you know, just for this one initiative. So all of a sudden, there was a change of cost driver, administrative cost to administration. Jump really up like this from here, and then of course driving the overall cost, whereas business, I think, continues. So the question we were asking ourselves at the end last year was, do we not need also a one in, one out rule for administrative costs, not just for business? So this was really something. This is of course, you know, we had elections and change of government, so there was not yet time to discuss and to see whether something like this is necessary, but a very interesting development. What you can see here also, if you're interested, I put out here detailed the propositions which considerably contributed to reduce costs and, of course, to increase the compliance costs in the time 2015-2019. Another question which is probably interesting in this context is the question, looking now from the perspective of an individual company, what are the compliance costs to a typical enterprise in Germany? And not because it's a different perspective. Either you look from a legislator point of view, or you look now from a company point of view. And so there are no statistics in this respect, but as you can see, we have done a number of case studies. Here together with the law office, the other one was with a craftsman business. Then we did with the Association of German Chambers of Industry and Commerce on a number of companies. And then we did an exercise together with Deloitte, also looking into insurance companies and mechanical engineering companies. And the interesting thing is, it's pretty, although these were totally independent case studies, the result is pretty much on the same level. So they are always ending up, let's say, depending on some details, some variations, but the overall impact of compliance costs on the let's say in relation to turnover or to the total cost at all, is in the order of magnitude of 3. In this case, insurance companies, as they are much more regulated, insurance companies, 7%. So you could say 3%. Is that really? Is it much, or is it really very little? Well, if you think a company has a, let's say, profitability in relation to turnover of 3%, this is a good profitability. So we are talking about, I think, here in order of magnitude, as far as compliance costs concerned, which correspond more or less, I think, to the total profit of a year of an average company. So this can make a difference at the end between profit and loss, between surviving of a company and not surviving. So the point I want to make, it looks first a little bit small, but if you look into the day-to-day business, and having been a CEO of a company for a number of years, 3%, or even, as you say, in the insurance company's case, going higher than that, is quite a lot. And it's worthwhile really to think how one can limit, I think, these cost implications. Well, I look a little bit, maybe I leave that out here and come to the interim conclusions. First one, progress in cost transparency and cost containment at the federal level. There is certainly progress. There are people that have now, these compliance cost question is an issue. Ministries are much more aware of this, I think, as in the old days. Ministers and members of parliament know the follow-up costs resulting from their political decisions to citizens, business, and public authorities. Repercussions on the legislative culture in the ministries. So what has changed is when ministries start taking up wonderful political ideas, translating them into a legislative proposal, there is now a step in between, I think, to reflect what does it really mean? What are the compliance costs? And do the compliance costs allow or justify this, I think, legislation? And this was something what did not happen, I think, in the past. So this is really, I think, a step in a positive direction. There are some negative results. On the federal state level, we do not have, with a few exceptions, similar activities, and without having the time to go into this, in Brussels, this is of course very important for us. 50% of the legislation relevant in Germany comes from Brussels, not from national. And in Brussels, we have the unique situation that the cooperation between the three institutions, Commission, Council, and Parliament, is in terms of better regulation, very different. The Commission is doing a lot, but the final legislators, the Parliament and the Council, are doing nothing or close to nothing. And this, of course, is in my view, unacceptable, in a way, The Commission, as the one making proposals, is doing a lot on transparency, calculating follow-up costs, and whatever you want, And then it comes to Council and Parliament, they make a deal, whatever, together at the end. Nobody knows really why, and nobody has an idea, if they have a compromise at the end, what is now the impact of this compromise? And this is a little bit contradiction in itself, in my view. Better regulation. I think it's important, if you look at legislation, that we have a certain cycle. You start with a draft, certain parties get involved, in the preparation. You take a decision in cabinet and parliament, it's enforced, and then you have an evaluation. And some of these, the draft, this is well done. Everyone we are doing this for a long time already. Decision is known, but the other points are still. And here I'm showing you two slides, which were actually I used for a discussion on the issue with the Chancellor 1.5 years ago. We had a discussion with the Chancellor. How are we preparing legislation in Germany? Is it really the state of the art we would like to see? And here you can see we have run this at the very beginning of the process. usually you have a choice of different alternatives. How you do that? Open mindedness regarding solutions, uncertainty, at the same time, lack of experience at the level of regulators. And then the process starts, you know, with the coalition agreement or coalition initiative. Then becomes the draft of legislation by the government, final legislation and the enforcement. And you see during the participation, for example, of the associations, of those representing the people concerned by the legislation, comes relatively late. Not at the very beginning, but here in the middle of the whole process. And those who have practical experience in enforcing legislation, who are in contact with business and citizens when the whole thing is adopted, you know, how to make that happen in reality, come at the very end. And this is certainly something which it doesn't make very much sense. So our conclusion, our proposal to the Chancellor was, do we not have, I think, these elements in the process of preparing legislation, do we not have to move that much more to the beginning? So we have proposed legislation labs and digital fitness checks, you know, very early in the process to make cabinet approval contingent on early participation of enforcement specialists. Key issues paper. So, you know, one problem we have seen in Germany is the whole discussion of legislation is usually done on the basis of legal text. Not every politician understands, you know, the legal text and really understands what it really means. So we said, do we not need a legal first draft, so to speak, simple, easy to understand concept of the proposed regulation, so that everybody can really join in the discussion. And also, we said we need a 4-week deadline, binding deadline for the participation of associations and local governments, you know, because we have seen in reality that in organizing the process, you know, there's always time pressure. Everybody wants to get it done very early for election reason or whatever, you know. So there was a permanent temptation to shorten, I think, the time span available to get external expertise really involved. And the ministries, of course, they had the idea we don't need all this, you know, we know everything in the ministries. So why do we spend so much time to get other people involved? These other people might have strange ideas, and that makes the whole thing much more complicated. So we better don't do that. So this is something we proposed. By the way, this is one of the consequences of COVID-19, that there was not the opportunity to deepen these discussions and really to see, do we get now to reforms in this respect? So, but just that you can see these two, I went into this conversation with the Chancellor just with these two slides. And at the conclusion of the Chancellor at the end was, well, that's obviously something we have to do. So, okay, ex post evaluation. You know, we talked about how to propose to organize the process of preparing legislation. And then we have here the whole cycle, you know, legislative procedure, implementation, evaluation after a certain time, and then conclusions, do we have to change the law? And what I found as not being, I think, I have no law background, you know, as an economist, always extremely strange was these ex post evaluation. That's mandatory only since 2013. So we have made in Germany, I don't know how that is in the United States, we have made for 150 years wonderful laws. And nobody asked at a certain time after it has become effective, yeah, what happened to them? Did we achieve our objectives? At which cost? Nothing. In specific cases, this was done, but not as a general principle. And we started as a council and to discuss that with the government. We said this is impossible. We cannot invest so much in this legislation. And at the end, nobody cares, I think, what is the outcome. So, just as an example, the dialogue of NKR, that's the abbreviation of our council, with the state secretaries committees, about exactly mandatory ex post evaluation of statutory regulations. The first question was, must we have an obligation, yes or no? And I said, prior to 2013, the ministries, it was at the discretion of the ministries. There was no obligation. And we, after very difficult discussions, I can tell you, we proposed that in 2013, in principle, mandatory, I think the evaluation became mandatory if compliance costs exceed 1 million euros. And this decision of the state secretary, I can tell you, was not really, was a little bit like the proposals, reducing bureaucracy. That was the same kind of discussion. Because it was, of course, an additional pressure on the ministries, afterwards to reflect what did we actually do. Did it make sense or did it not sense? Or did we make a mistake? So, and then now it became really, very interesting because there was a decision in principle to do that. But the question, how to do it in detail? I, as a chairman of the council, I did not dare to put that on the agenda at this point because the discussions on the principle were so emotional and so difficult in the government that I was afraid putting this question now also on the discussion that would blow up the whole thing. That I would lose. You need some support, at least a few people you have to convince to start the discussion. So this was not specified how to do that in detail. And that took a certain time because this, as you can imagine, was very difficult issue for the ministries. And then we started in 2017. My conclusion was, I said to my colleagues, we just start doing it, even if we don't have a decision. We simply start. When the ministries are sending their proposals to us, we are asking, where is now, I think, your ideas about the ex post evaluation data. And what we started asking was these triad. We wanted to have a clear statement. What is the objective of the law? What do you want to achieve? And you would be surprised how many laws are we found, without a very clear statement what they really wanted to achieve. What are the indicators which you can use later on to measure whether the objective was achieved? What is the indicator? And where do the data come from? Because otherwise the people after 3 to 5 years, they say, oh yes, we are ready. The objective is to clear the indicator, but we have no data. So that's the reason why we said, when a new law comes up, at this point of time, the government or the ministry must specify these 3 things, otherwise there's no way to adopt the law. And we did this more or less on a voluntary basis, and we were surprised ourselves, yes, that it worked really better than we expected. And then we took up, I think, encouraged by this discussion, the whole issue again. And then finally in 2019, there was a definite introduction of what we call the NKR trial. So these 3, let's say, statements of the ministries would be a precondition before they were allowed to go to cabinet. And you see, it has taken 6 years from the principal discussion to acceptance in detail, because the key question is, of course, the last point, quality assurance. Because if the ministries are doing that themselves, they are evaluating themselves. As the work the colleagues in the ministry have done a few years ago. And it's a question whether this is really objective or politically influenced. And therefore we said, if the ministry is doing the ex post evaluation itself, there must be a quality assurance at the end by a third party outside the ministry. And you can imagine the enthusiasm once again, and it was not an easy exercise. So, conclusion number 2, our first concern was practical suitability. The involvement of persons, agencies concerned, associations must be ensured as early as possible. That was the first point. With legislation, laboratories, binding deadlines before discussion in cabinet. So all the ministries want to go to cabinet, they want to get a decision. So this is, I think, the leverage you have, and you have to ask them, okay, you have to do all this before you go there. Ex post evaluation, the principle, no legislation without preceding evaluation of the status quo. And this is a specific point in Germany. We have some problems with not only the cost, but with the benefits. But that is simply, I leave that out for the moment. So this is, I think, the conclusion on better regulation. Because of time, I will simply stop here. And maybe we have another opportunity to discuss these other ideas on digitalization and modernization of them. But I stop here and thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
If you have a question, raise your hand and I'll start a list, and we'll also be monitoring on Zoom. So Zoom audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A box. Frank.
So Johannes, we're going to have a lot to talk about while you're here. So I have a comment and then a question. The comment is, well, so first of all, it's a pleasure to have a description of a government that seems to operate more or less rationally in terms of trying to reform itself. And,
to a certain extent.
Yeah, to a certain extent.
The discussions I mentioned, they were not rational, you know.
Yeah.
They were.
I can imagine with the ministries, treading on their turf.
And limiting their scope, you know.
Yeah.
That's
But so your office sounds like a kind of combination of OIRA and the Congressional Budget Office.
Yeah.
And actually, in the United States, the CBO has done these scorings with new legislation for quite a while. So I'm surprised.
I know. I met them. I visited them about, I think, 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And we had an exchange on this. And but okay, as one cannot pay a visit too often, that did not really lead to a good discussion.
But OIRA has been fairly politicized, but the CBO, I think, is still regarded as relatively nonpartisan. So that, maybe we don't do stuff. But did I hear correctly that you were involved with Deutsche Bahn and the German railways?
Yes.
Okay, so this is.
That was another part of my professional life.
Yes, okay, so that's great. So in our Leadership Academy for Development, we have been for many years teaching this Kennedy School case on Stuttgart 21. And that is not an example of smooth, efficient government. I mean, if you don't know about Stuttgart 21, this was a proposal that started in the 1980s to put a high-speed rail terminal in Stuttgart, Baden-Württemberg, and it led to the downfall of this CDU government of the state because it was so controversial. Can you just, and the reason we teach it is on your chart. You said, you need to get participation and input from stakeholders. Yeah. And the way we teach that case is that that's the big mistake that was made, is that there wasn't adequate, real consultation early on. And I wonder if you could just reflect on why that ended up being such a... That
was part 3 of my presentation, which comes next time. Yeah. No, this is really... what is here under the heading of how to modernize the administration. Of course, you cannot implement this one-to-one to everything. Even this participation in an early stage must follow certain rules, and certainly the government must remain the master of the business. It is not acceptable, of course, that this is then, let's say, changed, I think, into a kind of political game, or political confrontation. This is a preparatory process for legislation. So, and therefore, everybody has a role to play, but of course, a rule following certain rules. And the government or the ministry in charge, of course, they must retain control of the whole process. What happened in Stuttgart is something totally different. That is that the whole planning processes and approval process for infrastructure projects in Germany, it developed in a very strange way over the last 30 years. There was a major effort after reunification, because the transport minister at that time, he said, I cannot renew the infrastructure of East Germany with the wonderful procedures having been developed in West Germany, for the last, 20, 30 years. And then he said, I'll make a legal proposal to shorten all these delays, approval delays by half. And he did that. So this was then really a major reduction of all these, usual delays which are in these planning and approval procedures for infrastructure projects. But that was the last time, that was in 1991. And after 1991, when the whole, let's say, environment discussion really, I think, became pretty lively, and got a major, let's say, influence on all this. Everybody added something to the planning and approval procedures, one aspect, and also these people have to be included and other people have to be included. And nobody was asking, what does it lead to at the end? What is the overall length of the procedure? Is it still realistic? And if you have maybe on another Thursday, a second part of this presentation, I can show you even the reaction, the Supreme Judge in Germany on administrative procedures. He made a statement in May last year saying the average time of bigger planning and approval, for planning and approval, just for this, for major infrastructure, I think, projects is now on the average 10, 11, 12 years. And how can you modernize a country, I think, with delays like this?
I bet you California beats you in terms of how long it takes to get one of these projects.
And we have made proposals, And the funny thing for me personally is, that in the same people in the last government, federal government, who have always rejected our proposals, specific proposals to shorten these procedures, are now, as they have seen that in the public opinion, this plays a key role. Public is expecting progress. The same people are now proposing, yes, we have to hasten, this. And I'm looking forward now to see in which way the government is taking care of this. But this is something I would propose maybe on one of the future Thursdays. I make the second part of this presentation, coming then to these questions. I will show you examples of German infrastructure which have taken important ones. For example, the deepening of the river Elbe in Hamburg. The question of life or death of the Hamburg harbor, has taken, I think, at the end, 30 years. I mean, this is ridiculous.
All right, we have more questions. Unfortunately, the rest of the Thursdays to clear it up are full, but we would love to have any number of discussions, casual or otherwise. So, Eric.
Thank you for this presentation. It was fascinating. And this is what I would expect from the land of paper, a more rational approach to bureaucracy. But I have three specific questions.
Yeah.
One is, you made this very curious comment, and by the way, I'm a lawyer, I'm not burdened by being an economist.
Sorry for my mistake.
But you made this very curious comment. Decisions are based on law, not government.
Yeah.
And that raises the question in my mind, who interprets the law? My second question is, one of the reforms that you suggested and was adopted was this key issues paper. Who prepares the key issues paper? And my final question is, who chooses the outside entity for quality assurance?
Yep. Okay, the first one, if you say this again, the
first one is decisions are based on law, not government. My question is, who interprets the law?
Well, this is clear that everybody is at the government or everybody who is basing a decision, I think, on a specific law. And in doing this, he is, of course, interpreting the law, interpreting, for example, that this can be done on the basis of this law. So I think that depends, of course, but in our case, as our activities were based on the law, I think my attitude as a German was everything is allowed which is not explicitly forbidden. Otherwise, you cannot develop something. So the only thing which is you find in the law is that we have these compliance costs, I think, controlled. The law doesn't say anything that we, I think, are asked, to make proposals how to modernize certain processes, how to streamline, I think, legislative preparatory processes. But as I said, having worked in the government myself for more than 20 years, my attitude was always everything is allowed and possible as long as the law does not explicitly say you are not allowed to do that, And then, of course, you have to have acceptance, because every day somebody in the government could have come and say, yes, you are not allowed to do that. There's no authorization in the law. But in 15 years, nobody ever showed up doing that. So that was how it worked, So maybe it was sufficiently convincing on what we put on the table. But I have to say, at the end, we really suffered from this COVID-19 period because, as I said, all the discussions if you want to change a system, a government system, you know by your own experience how difficult that is. The status quo has an enormous weight. And for this, you need exactly what we have now here with a few persons, that you are sitting around the table, and if necessary, you have 3 or 4 or 5 hours, to get it really somehow then done. And this was not possible during the last 2 years. Therefore, the second question, this was not yet adopted by the government. So we made this proposal, but as I said, in practice, starting from the beginning of 2020, it was the end of these kinds of, let's say, reform discussions really within the government. And that was, in a way, we have lost 2 years. So I'm so happy about that. The ex post evaluation decision, the final was taken in November 2019. Looking back, but if you would have missed this point of time, 3 or 4 months later, it wouldn't have taken place, So in the last one.
Last question is, who chooses the outside entity for quality assurance?
But the ministry is free. The ministry can take an independent research institute, for example. They can also ask here our council. They could ask us, I think, to have a look on this. But what is not acceptable anymore is that the ministry evaluates itself. This is something we can certainly, and this, can you imagine, was a really the most critical question at the end, because of course they have lost a certain way of control on this, and this was never an easy exercise.
Yeah, thank you so much for this presentation. This was really interesting. So I have 2 questions, and one I think is just going to lead me, make me up myself. So I'm originally from Germany, and I thought I followed German politics quite closely, but honestly, I've never heard about this, which is shocking because it seems like you're doing such important work. So this leads me to my first question. I was wondering if you can talk a little more about public perceptions of the council, to what extent, it seems like your work is really important to legitimize the legislative process and legitimize individual laws and regulations. And I was wondering if you anything about how widely, how the public perceives your work. And then my other question was about partisan influence or the politicization of the council. So you said that you're trying to be as best as possible to be politically neutral. Parties take turns, I think, nominating members. But I was wondering if there's any attempt to influence your work and how you can guard yourself against that.
No, the first question is why is it not more known in the public? Okay, I have always said, and everybody who has worked in politics knows, politicians are very sensitive when in a difficult discussion, you go public, and you say the newspapers, oh, this stupid minister does not understand why this should be changed or whatever, So publicly criticizing these people, and the newspapers only listen to you if you have something negative. If you are saying this is a wonderful minister, nobody is interested. If you are saying he is an idiot, then they are really listening. Then they are kind. So, and my conclusion, and as having worked, as I said already, in the government for long, is you have to make up your mind what you want. Either you are a respected advisor, but then I think you have to concentrate on the internal processes. Okay. And I have always said, okay, I believe in the strengths of my arguments, my experience. I think the case I have, if I go to the state committee of state, the key point at the end of the day is the strengths of the points I put on the table. Either I cannot command, I have to convince them. And if this is true, then let's say the public cannot really do very much. I think what can happen is that the people say, okay, this has gone to the public, this is already in the newspapers, sorry, we cannot discuss that here internally anymore, it has become a political issue. And that is exactly what I wanted to avoid. And I've always said, our role is, we want to be, let's say, a respected internal advisor in the government, profiting from our unique situation, being independent, so in a way external, but nevertheless the only independent part being integrated into the preparatory internal process of the government. So that is a little bit the reason Also in Germany, many people have asked me, why do you not give more interviews and do this and that? And my answer has always been, you have to make up your mind what you want. You want to be well known in the press and the media, or you want to be a respected internal advisor, and people to whom I give advice know that I will not try to get, let's say, to support, to increase my own profile, you know, at their cost. That is something I wanted at all costs to do. And of course, being a little bit older and having already my professional career behind me, that is also certainly not such a difficult, I think, decision. You know? No, but I wanted it, even the people didn't like many things. I've made the experience that I always respected us, because I think the quality of the arguments we have put on the table, I think they could not deny that there was something behind it. You know? And that was the decision I've taken. Maybe my successor now will do it in a different way. I don't know. So sorry, and you love the second point?
Well, the other question was about kind of partisan influence and like how you guard yourselves against like politicization. That's my question.
Well, no, this is a question of independence. I'm independent, you know? And the nice thing is that our body was composed, I think I said there are 10 members, and the parliamentary parties from opposition and government, the parliamentary parties can make proposals. So we had, from out of these 10, 5 were proposed by the Christian Democrats, 3 by the Social Democrats, 1 from the Liberals, and 1 from the Greens. And as a chairman, my approach was that I said, okay, how do we want to work? And this is an experience I had already made in Brussels when I was CEO of the European Railway Organization. And I said, I will try to run this council in a way that we always come to unanimous opinion. But it's not certainly in our written rules, because I said, if somebody should misuse this, you know, like this filibustering or whatever, you know, that means blocking by his behavior, by not let's say, taking a constructive part in the discussion. As soon as this starts, I will take majority votes. And this has worked for 15 years. We have, in 15 years, all the decisions we have taken were unanimous decisions, because I've said, if we ourselves do not believe in the strength of our points or our arguments, how can we convince others? And I think I can say that this did not was not at the cost of let's say time delays or whatever. I said we are proud that not even one legislative proposal was postponed or delayed because our opinion was not did not arrive in time. So this is that was also the strength why we had influence, because the politicians who like, of course, to split bodies, you know, that they try to take influence behind the curtain, you know, and try to find out, do they really agree in a body or are there different opinions? And therefore I said, okay, I will do everything what I can, that we are always coming to a common position. And maybe I was lucky because of the people around. It worked for 15 years.
That is a very, very quick follow-up. Just like, so you said that the members are being nominated by the different parties. And like once you nominate, you also immediately
it's not a formal nomination, it's an informal nomination. And then formally the government is free to whom to propose, you know? But in practice they are respecting and taking into account these proposals coming. And then the government takes a decision and makes this decision is a proposal to the President of the Republic, who finally then gives the documents and whatever, you know.
I was just going to press a little bit more on this question of politicization and avoiding it. So your response was that you're independent, but still, how do you insulate yourself from, you know, lobby groups like businesses that want you to actually inflate the cost, perhaps, of the implementation of a certain regulation? I mean, what you're doing is inherently political, and as you yourself said, you know, 3% or 7% burden of a regulation can mean survival or a company going bankrupt. So So that I really was quite interested in. I understand the political groups from your, from by having a bipartisan or multi-partisan commission and then being sure to be unanimous in your recommendations or reports. But how do you avoid, a business organization or a large company just calling you up and saying, this is so onerous on us, and having that in any way influence what you produce?
Oh, I have a wonderful answer. This will be a surprise to you,
Yeah, because I study Russia.
I would have been happy if the business organization would have played a more active role.
Interesting.
And their behavior was one of the big disappointments in the last 15 years. Why? The culture, how the business organizations in Germany, at least in Berlin, or earlier in Bonn, and in Berlin, worked really was a little bit like the parliamentarians. They looked into every law and said, oh, where are the critical points which are touching directly our interests? And for this, they have then made proposals. What they have never learned and never invested really in resources was, what are the overall compliance costs? They didn't really get involved into this. They did not hire the people, they did not, and therefore, on this discussion, what is the final impact? Business in the first, the whole one in, one out rule was only for business, And my expectation was they will all, as you said, they will all come through the door and say, listen, these calculations are wrong, it's just the other way around, you did not take into account this and that, it's just different. Nothing happened. And my explanation is the people sitting in these organizations in Berlin, following what the government is doing, they are simply not accustomed to this kind of quantificative approach. They were accustomed to the old way of lobbying. I look into a law, where is the paragraph which is directly touching my interest, on taxation or whatever, and they have learned, okay, then I have to go to the members of parliament and try to take influence if that is possible, it's fine. But they never had learned to say, okay, we are not looking on specific paragraphs. We are looking on the legislative project as a whole. And we are asking for the overall impact. And this would, of course, would have asked for, I think, to organize within the associations, to reorganize them, to have, let's say, also more inflow coming from their members, on actual data. And this, everybody who has done that knows there's a lot of work, I think, you have to do. You need resources, you need people who know the methodology, etc. And that is exactly what they did not do. They said, well, they always told me, it's wonderful that you are there. We are supporting you, but don't expect from us any kind of active contribution. It's a big surprise for me, but a very clear-cut experience over the last 6 years.
Germany, because can you imagine here, with the Obamacare?
Well, as a final question, and as a sort of follow-on to that, my question is where do the political motivations for creating this council and changing the policy process come from in the first place? You would imagine the main stakeholder who benefits from this is business. So it is surprising that they don't care. It sort of changes the growth environment potentially to reduce the burden of the state and to make sure that you have a process that's predictable. And to have this timeline for lobbying, which in the United States can drag on forever. So where do the political motivations lie, and how do you think you can get those similar kinds of motivations in other places, other countries?
Let me put a general phrase in the statement at the beginning. I think business organizations are, by definition, not interested in the quality of legislation per se.
Yeah.
We are interested in the quality of legislation per se, and that is a fundamental difference. And how did the whole thing develop? It's interesting because it was really a number of very special conditions. In 2005, we had elections in Germany, federal elections. And there was one person who played obviously the key role. I was not yet appointed, so I only know it from research I did for the book I published recently, really to find out how the whole thing came into existence. This was a guy called Mr. Röttgen. Mr. Röttgen later on, he was Minister for Environment, etc. He was at this time what we call that. He was not the chairman of the parliamentary party, but let's say the general manager, what we call first parliamentary secretary. of the parliamentary party of the Christian Democrats. And he had connections, personal connections with the Netherlands. And he heard about these activities in the Netherlands, about these development of the standard cost model and all these kind of things. And he was interested in this personally. He asked that somebody, an expert or go there, get all the details, make a proposal. And he came back, and Mr. Röttgen really, more or less as an influential person, certainly, alone, managed to get, I think, a paragraph into the coalition agreement of 2005 after the elections, that the government would set up, I think, such a council similar to what the Dutch had done there already there. So, and he managed then later on to convince the coalition partner, the Social Democrats. By the way, the person he had to convince was the present chancellor now, Mr. Scholz, who was his equivalent for the Social Democratic Parliamentary Party. And he convinced him that this is a good idea. And the funny thing is, this law at the end is one of the few laws which was not, I think, developed and designed in the government, what is the normal case in the parliamentary system. It was exclusively written and designed by the parliamentary party itself, because the mistrust in the government, that the government would not have an interest, I think, to set up something like this, was, very, very big. So that was the history. It was in a way, Mr. Röttgen as a person, who I think without Mr. Röttgen, it's very unlikely that at least at this point of time, the whole thing would get signed. Then Röttgen managed that the chancellor, I mean, I would not say that Mrs. Merkel was enthusiastic about this, but she had obviously the feeling it's somehow important, so why not? And the situation in 2006, when the law was adopted in the government, was the chancellery was in favor, and the Ministry of Economics. All the other ministries were against it. And therefore, the decision of the parliamentary party, but we don't ask them, we leave them out, we simply adopt the law. So one of the few cases in the last, I would say, 20, 30 years, also in my personal experience, that really a serious initiative was exclusively taken in the parliamentary party and finally adopted, although, let's say, support from the government side was limited. Therefore, the law is relatively short. It's 2 pages.
Well, thank you so much for this fascinating talk, and please hear all year, everyone.
So maybe we can find